We're engaged in a study of the life of Moses as we work on learning life lessons from the experience of Moses. What I want us to focus on today is, I think all of us would like to have children who honor the Lord and who honor us. All of us want to have children who are a credit to society, who are a credit to us as parents, right? We want to raise children that are fun to be around, who are thoughtful and caring and loving and so on. And so what I would like to do today, as we look at this chapter, which focuses more on Moses' parents than on Moses, is to focus on godly parenting principles that we see. And I have identified 6 principles that I want to share with you as we think together from this event in the life of Moses. It's one of the most famous stories, right? Every Sunday school person sooner or later gets to the story of Moses in the basket in the Nile and so on. And so as we deal with this story today, we begin with, first of all, the principle that godly parenting requires godly parents. All right? It seems like that would go without saying, but again and again, the observation is down through the years that there are parents who are not walking with God as they ought, but they want their children to walk with God. They want their children to be godly, but they're not willing to do that themselves. And so parenting has to start with the parents, has to start with you and me. What we read in the text is that it was a man from the house of Levi married a daughter of Levi. Now, their names are given to us in Exodus chapter 6. Their names are the name of Moses' father is, I got to help you here with the Bible trivia, right? Name of Moses' father is Amram, and his mother's name was Jochebed, okay? Amram and Jochebed. Now, it says they are from the house of Levi. It doesn't give us a whole lot of other background, but just to point that out, rather than just saying there was a couple who had a child, it's designed to point out that they come from, obviously, the family of Levi, from the tribe of Judah. They are what we would call, in today's parlance, Christians. They are believers. And so we have this information provided with regard to the parents here. These parents had children in spite of Pharaoh's command. Now, you need the backstory a little bit. In chapter 1, we're told that there was a Pharaoh who came on the scene who did not know Joseph. Joseph was Jacob's son who was taken down into Egypt. He thought he died. He ultimately becomes second to Pharaoh in the land. And he's the one who delivers Egypt from the famine. 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph is the one that Pharaoh appoints to do that, and he becomes number 2 in all the land. So, Jacob's family's all grateful to Pharaoh. All of the Egyptians are grateful to to Joseph. But the day comes when Joseph is forgotten, and a new Pharaoh arises. The Israelites are very abundant in the land, and the Pharaoh says, we need to rein them in. We need to bring them under control. And so they enslaved them and made them laborers for the state. And so they became slaves. Pharaoh then said, as they continued to multiply, the children need to be monitored here. And whenever a baby boy is born, that baby boy needs to be left out to exposure to die. And he commanded the midwives to do that. What happens is the midwives refuse to do that because of their faith in God. And so when Pharaoh calls them back and says, how come you're not obeying my rules, my orders? What they say is, these Israeli women are really strong. They have their babies before we get there. Now, I think it was a plan that was hatched up by the midwives to teach the Israeli ladies, the Jewish ladies about having babies, and I think they were hanging out down at the corner and saying, we're not coming unless you absolutely have to have us, because we don't want to be in this compromising situation. And so they were sort of tutoring them and monitoring them, and as the baby boys were born, they hung back so they didn't have to expose them. I'm reading between the lines there, but God blessed the midwives for their behavior. At any rate, Amram and Jochebed decide they're going to have a baby in spite of the command of the king. What we read in Acts, as Stephen comments on this, he says it was he, Pharaoh, who took shrewd advantage of our race and mistreated our fathers, that they would expose their infants and they would not survive. It was at this time that Moses was born. He was lovely in the sight of God. He was nurtured 3 months in his father's home. So these parents, when the baby was born, however that all came about, when the baby was born, they saw something in this child and decided that the child would be protected for these 3 months. Hebrews adds another word of commentary to this. In Hebrews we read, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. So what we have are parents who are godly parents who are determined to do the right thing in spite of what the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, has said to them. And so we have these godly parents who are providing the protection and care and instruction and direction and so forth for Moses. Here's the bottom line. In order to have godly children, you have to have godly parents. Godly parenting starts with godly parents. We have to be godly. We have to decide that we're going to honor the Lord, that we're going to spend time in the Word, that we're going to live according to God's principles. And we're not going to just live by the culture around us or by the rules of the government around us, but we're going to be godly individuals. It's not a parent's job to have godly children. It's a parent's job to make sure their children have godly parents. It's our job to make sure that we are godly. And you can put grandparents in here. We have, many of us, exposure and opportunity to mentor and teach and encourage our grandchildren. And so both parents and grandparents. Dave Ramsey puts it this way. He says, you have to teach kids by example, not with words. They can smell a hypocrite from a mile away. And he's right. There are a lot of Christian parents who are hypocrites. They want their children to be godly children. They want them to be model children, but they are not willing to live by the principles of God's word themselves. And so you and I have to make that commitment that we're going to be the people that God wants us to be first. That's principle number one. Godly parenting requires godly parents. Second principle, godly parents recognize God's children. And I put God's children in quotation marks here. What happens in the story, it says at this time Moses was born, he was lovely in the sight of God. In the book of Exodus, it says that they saw, that Amram and Jochebed saw that the baby was beautiful. And so they hid him for 3 months. I would ask the question, who has a baby that isn't beautiful? Right? Were your children not beautiful? I mean, my children were more beautiful than your children. Right? So our children are beautiful to us. So it had to be something else. We don't have other places in the Bible where we have babies are born and it says it was beautiful. It doesn't say Isaac was born and he was beautiful. It doesn't say Jacob was born and he was beautiful. But Moses, it says he was born and he was beautiful. And it says that he was beautiful in the sight of God. Now that's really interesting, isn't it? Beautiful in the sight of God. And so God saw something about him. I don't know what the text means exactly, to be very honest with you. It says the Hebrew word is the word good. They saw him that he was good. And it's translated beautiful, which is a possible translation. The word in Acts is a word that means to be urbane. It means to be of a city, as opposed to someone who's of the country. And so there was something classy about this baby, but it was in God's eyes. So that's really interesting when you think about it. When we think of someone being lovely in God's eyes, there are several things that occur to me. One is that this baby, like all babies, is created by God. All right? Babies are created by God. All babies, regardless of circumstances, whether the parents are married or not married, whether it was intended or not intended, or whatever, all babies are created by God. God spoke through David as a prophet in the Old Testament. And he said through David in Psalm 139 that God was forming the baby in the womb of the mother. In darkness you formed me. In darkness you created me, and you wrote down the days of my life, all of them, before I was ever conceived. So God is the one who creates the child. And when God sends a child into your home, it's a child that he has fashioned. It's a child that he has created. We're all different. We have different temperaments, different personalities. In some cases, we have homes that have children that have special needs. They're created by God. So whatever the child, however many they are, whatever the birth order is, whatever the temperaments are, and so forth, that's all created by God. Now, they're created by God. They're also created for God. Children are created by God for himself, ultimately. You and I don't own our children. They belong to the Lord. So they're created by God, they're created for him, and they are entrusted to us. The Bible uses a word that sometimes means loaned. They are loaned to us. So God gives us children, A, for our joy, B, for his glory, and C, that they might be reared to serve him one day. They don't belong to us. So your grandchildren don't belong to you. Your children don't belong to you. They belong to God. Young people, you belong to God. You don't belong to your parents. Now, you have to be under your parents' authority. You have to obey your parents. But God has created you for himself. And he takes great joy in who you are, in what you are, in what you look like, in your gifts and temperament and everything else. He made you the way you are for his glory. And so that's his purpose. The government does not have authority over children. Parents do. We read in the verse that we already looked at that Amram and Jochebed were not afraid of the king's edict. So parents have responsibility for the care of their children, not the state. I read something that really blew me away. I knew that she sort of said this, but I never really saw it. There was a thing on the web somewhere that said that Mrs. Clinton believes it is the responsibility of the state to care for, train, and educate and rear children. And nothing could be further from the truth. It is the responsibility of parents to do that. You determine the care of your children. You are the one, as a parent, who decides how your child will be cared for, how your child will be provided for. You determine the education of your children. Now, our government says it's mandatory for a child to have an education. That's a good thing. But you have options. And you have the responsibility to decide how your child will be educated. In my opinion, sometimes it's good in a public school setting. Sometimes it's good in a Christian school setting. Sometimes it's good in a homeschool setting. And it varies from child to child and from period to period in the child's life. There are different times in the life of the individual where he or she needs different sets of circumstances. And so we need to be understanding of that. The state does not determine what your child should know. You determine that. And you have the responsibility to oversee all of that in terms of how it works. Thirdly, parents determine their church upbringing of their children. You determine if your child goes to church. You don't say to your child, son, do you want to go to church today? Do you ask him if he wants to brush his teeth today? Do you ask him if he wants to go to school today? Do you ask him if he wants to go to the doctors? No. Children are under the authority of their parents, and parents decide that children will attend church. You don't say to your child, do you want to go to church Sunday night? No, you bring them. And the reason you bring them is because godly parents are necessary for godly children. And because you recognize that this child belongs to the Lord. And so you are bringing that child into the various situations where he or she is learning. You don't say, do you want to go to youth group? That's a rule. You go to youth group. You don't say, do you want to go to Awana? No, you go to Awana because that's what we determined is best for you. At some point, children make their own decisions, but not until they become adults and they can pay their own way. You don't provide for children who disobey you with the basic requirements of our Christian faith. You determine that, and you don't leave it up for option. It's not a discussion. You don't go through every Sunday or every Wednesday night this battle about whether we're going to go to the church program or not. That's already decided. Because you have responsibility for the rearing of God's child. That child belongs to the Lord. And so your job is to make sure, to the best of your ability, that that child loves Jesus and serves him. All right, the duties of godly parents. You don't provoke your children to wrath, but you do bring them up into training and admonition of the Lord. It's not an option. It's not an option. It's what we do. Because these children that God has lent to us belong to him. Third principle. Godly parenting recognizes God's protection. All right? You cannot protect your children forever. What happens here is that she hid, Jochebed hid Moses for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket, covered it over with tar and pitch, put the child in it, and put it in the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Can you imagine what was going on inside of her at that point? We read the story, and it's so familiar to us, we don't even stop to think about all of the human, motherly emotions that she had to be feeling at this point. Wow. To deposit this 3-month-old child in this basket, in the bulrushes at the edge of the Nile, and leaving him there. Now, thank the Lord that most of the time this doesn't happen at 3 months. But sooner or later it happens. Sooner or later you have to trust your child to the Lord. The greenhouse is good for a time. It's good to protect our children, but you can't protect them forever because they are God's servants to this world. He has intended that your children and your grandchildren and mine will become servants to the world around them. And in order for that to happen, they have to learn how to live in that world. And they are going to be exposed to danger, all sorts of danger. And at that point, we have to trust God to provide for them. And so parents entrust children to God's care. It says, when Pharaoh's daughter opened the basket, she saw the child, and behold, the child was crying. And she said, get rid of him anyhow. No, she had pity on him. Moses' mother had no way of knowing how Pharaoh's daughter was going to respond. She put that baby in a basket and left him by the edge of the river, entrusting him to God, knowing that he was created for God's glory, he was created to serve the Lord, and knowing that God was going to do something, but she didn't know what it was. And when Pharaoh's daughter had pity, God stepped in to protect Moses in that situation. For you, it could happen for your child in a middle school locker room. You have no way of knowing what's going to take place, and you can't be there. When that happens, I think of Daniel, the story in Daniel chapter 1, carried into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar, taken to school in Babylon, and placed in the dorm and the cafeteria with all of the rest of those individuals. And Daniel had to determine that he was going to serve the Lord. And you know the story. And God protects him in that situation. Sometimes it's around hypocritical Christians. There are Christians who are bad influences on our kids. And so what do you do with hypocritical Christians? I remember the story of Samuel. His mother took him as a very young child and left him at the tabernacle under the care of Eli. And Eli's sons were as carnal and ungodly and selfish and self-focused. I mean, the sins that they were involved in are incredible. And God protected Samuel in the midst of that situation. Sooner or later, you have to trust your kids to the Lord. The goal is not to raise a perfect child. The goal is to raise a child who loves God. And that's what we're after as we work on this. Fourth goal, fourth principle. Godly parenting retains continual watch over children. It's not like when you know you have to entrust them to God, you just sort of wash your hands of the whole thing and let them go. Instead, you watch. It says in the story, when she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket, covered it with pitch, put him in the basket. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. Miriam was stationed to watch over Moses. She's about 10, 8, 9, 10, 11, somewhere along in there at this point. And so the mother, Jochebed, says to her daughter, I can't be here. It would be too obvious if I'm standing here. So I want you to pretend that you're playing along the riverbank. I want you to keep an eye on your brother. If nothing happens, let me know. I'll come back and get him. If Pharaoh's daughter comes, as we think she will, because that was her pattern, this is what you are to say. And so we have Miriam who pulls off this thing as she is watching for her mother over the care of her brother. The mother, I think, had instructed Miriam. I think there's an elaborate plan here. It's just too coincidental not to happen. Coincidental that Miriam would even be there. Secondly, that she as a young child would know what to say and know how to pull it off. She had been trained by her mother to be very responsible at this stage in her early life, and that is pulled off by them. Sometimes you watch over your child from up close, and sometimes you watch over your child from a distance. Sometimes you're right there, hands-on, working alongside and checking out everything. And sometimes you're entrusting them to this long term. But you still are watching. You still have your eyes on. You still are aware of what's going on. And it's not just at the playground. All right? It's not just at the playground that we watch our kids. But you watch them on the computer. You watch them on their phones. These phones are wonderful tools, but they are horrible tools at the same time. And you need to be on top of what your children do with their phones and their computers. You need to be looking over their shoulder. You need to be in their face on a regular basis. They're not going to like it. They're going to say it's an invasion of privacy. You say, tough. That's the way life is. Do you know that there are people on the internet who are there seeking to talk young people into taking their lives? into committing suicide. There are people on the internet who are preying on young people, and they're deliberately leading them into pornography and horrible stuff. So you need to be watching over your children. You need to perhaps delay the use of these tools until they demonstrate that they're capable. I know some young people are not going to like what I'm saying here, but it's the way it is in this life. You don't understand how badly those things can harm you and how hard it is to get rid of that stuff once it gets up here in your head. And so parents, we need to be those who step in and watch from a distance. You need to watch them with their friends. Sometimes the people that you trust the most can be the worst influence. You need to watch them in their entertainment. You don't let them go just any movie. You don't let them go to a movie because their friends are going necessarily. You don't let them play with video games that are violent and filled with disgusting language and are horrible for people to watch. You say, well, it's just a game. It's harmless. It's not harmless. It's stuff that we don't need. And so you watch your children. Fifth principle, whatever we are. Godly parenting remains flexible. What happened here is Pharaoh's daughter came and found the child, as you know. And Pharaoh's daughter, in the middle of the paragraph, says, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. The child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. What if Jochebed had said, I'm sorry, no way, it's my child? She would have probably lost everything. She had to be open to the fact that what she wanted was not necessarily what God had intended, what was going to happen. We want everything to be laid out. We want everything to be just perfectly organized. We want things to be so thought out and planned out, and we're going to just go through the patterns, and we don't have to worry about things. There is no such way in this life. What happens is things don't happen the way we think they're going to happen. And things that we don't think will ever happen, happen. We live in a fallen world. We live in a world that is governed by the evil one. We went to a funeral yesterday of a fine young Christian guy who took his own life at age 22. Horrible tragedy. Why? I have no clue. Somehow the evil one got a hold of him and lied to him, and he took his own life. We have to be flexible to allow God to do what he wants. God has a better plan. You have to stay open to that plan. You know, we all want to put father and sons on our business, don't we? We want Smith and Sons, Emmons and Sons. We all have these things that we want for our kids. But it doesn't often work that way. My son said for years, I will never, ever be a senior pastor. He grew up in a pastor's home. He said, I'll never be a senior pastor. Do you know what he is today? He's a senior pastor at Grace Bible Church in Newfane, New York. It was God's doing. God brought him around. He has a bit of a wild streak, like his mother. I don't think she's here. He loves to party and have fun, like his mother. And it just took time for him to get into the Greek and become godly like his father, you know. I didn't say all that in the first service, and I'm kidding, right? But God had to bring him to that point. He saw stuff that our family went through over the years, and he said, I'm not going there. But then step by step, God brings him to that point. You can write Smith and Sons, but God has a plan, and the children belong to him. You and I are rearing children to serve the Lord. And we're doing that with a view to allowing God to lead them for what he wants them to do. Final principle. Godly parenting relinquishes parental rights. There comes a time when you have to back off and let go. We often have those dreams for our children, the things that we want them to do. You know what happened with Moses? We read, after he'd been set aside, Pharaoh's daughter took him away, nurturing him as her own son. Moses was educated in the learning of the Egyptians. He was a man of power in words and deeds. It was God's plan to give Moses an Egyptian university education and to give him exposure to the government of Egypt so that one day he would have both the education and the experience to govern the nation of Israel. If he had stayed in their home, he never would have had that. And so at this point in time, it was God's plan for Moses to be taken away from his parents. Now, fortunately, that's not the case for most of us at that age. But the day will come when that happens. And so we have to be open to that. God created children for his purposes, not for yours or mine. He created children to serve him, to glorify him, to be what he wants them to be. And so we have to hold everything God gives us, including and especially our children, with open hands. You have to say, God, everything I have is yours. That's true with our money, it's true with our possessions, it's especially true with our children. We say, Lord, I have reared them, I have loved them, I have done the best I can. Or it maybe wasn't quite the best I could, but it is what it is. Here they are. Use them for your glory. What we read in the text is not only did Jochebed have to let her son go, I suspect she maintained contact over those years while he was going to school in Pharaoh's house and so on. My suspicion is there was contact. She figured out a way to send messages back and forth, maybe to meet once in a while, whatever. But the day came at age 40 when he had to leave town. And so he now is gone out into the wilderness, and there's no indication in the text that she ever saw him again. That when Moses presented himself to his people, to his brothers, as a deliverer, and they rejected him, and he fled because Pharaoh had threatened to kill him, he went into the wilderness for 40 years, and they never saw each other again. It may well be that the day will come when you will stand at an airport and wave goodbye to your children, because God has called them to serve on a mission field somewhere. God has called your grandchild to another part of the world, all the way across the country or whatever. Now, it's not as bad as it was 100 years ago. 100 years ago, they got on a boat and they took off for some foreign land, and there was very little communication, an occasional letter, maybe. Nowadays, we have Facebook and we have email and we have phones that you can talk to each other and see each other and all that sort of thing. But it still means saying goodbye. See, you are rearing your children to become the servants of the Lord, not your servants. They're not being reared to love you and serve you. They will love you if you love the Lord and prepare them, but you're preparing them to become the servants of Jesus. And he may use them in ways that you have no clue at the present. At the end of the day, the question is, have I pointed my children to the Lord? Have I prepared my children to serve Jesus? That's what it's all about. And the principle is true. Jesus teaches it over and over. Whatever you try to hold on to, you will lose. But whatever you lose for my sake and the kingdom's sake, you will gain. That's the principle with rearing children. So, bottom line, rearing godly children prepares them for God's kingdom. So, number one, regard your child as God's loan. Think about it now. Whatever age your children or grandchildren are, think about it. They are God's loan to you. He has entrusted you with their upbringing, with their care, nurture, and protection, just as he entrusted Jesus to Mary and Joseph. Same thing. Rear your child as God's steward. You're a servant of God for rearing your children. And thirdly, release your children to God's work when the time comes. Father, help us as we seek to wrap our minds around this. In some cases, we're dealing with children that are estranged. In some cases, we're dealing with young children. In some cases, we're dealing with adult children or grandchildren. Lord, in whatever the circumstances, you take these words, these principles, and apply them in our lives. Give us understanding as to how we should enable these things to work for us. We want to be the parents and grandparents and children too, those of us who are here, that you want us to be for your glory. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. See you tonight.